Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we are taking a deep dive into one of the most pivotal moments in world history. The American Revolution. How did a collection of 13 British colonies manage to take on the mightiest empire on earth and win? It's a story of courage, conflict, and the birth of a nation. So grab your popcorn and let's turn back the clock. Our story begins in the mid-18th century. The American colonies were a bustling, growing part of the British Empire. People had crossed the Atlantic for all sorts of reasons: religious freedom, economic opportunity, or just a fresh start. For a long time, things were pretty good. Britain practiced a policy called salutary neglect, which basically meant they left the colonies to govern themselves for the most part. This allowed the colonies to develop their own unique identities, economies, and political systems. They were British subjects, sure, but they were also Virginians, New Yorkers, and Pennsylvanians, with a strong sense of local pride and independence. But then, everything changed. In 1763, Britain won a long and expensive conflict called the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, as it was known in America. This war left Britain with a massive amount of debt. Looking at their vast empire, King George III in the British Parliament thought, well, the war was fought partly to protect the American colonies, so it's only fair they help pay for it. This shift in policy marked the end of salutary neglect and the beginning of a whole lot of trouble. The first big move was the Sugar Act of 1764, followed by the truly infamous Stamp Act of 1765. This act required colonists to buy a special stamp for all sorts of paper goods, newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards. Now, the tax itself wasn't huge, but the principle behind it was a massive deal. The colonists had no elected representatives in the British Parliament, so, from their perspective, Parliament was taxing them without their consent. This gave rise to the rallying cry that would define the entire revolution: no taxation without representation. The backlash was immediate and fierce. People organized protests, boycotted British goods, and formed groups like the Sons of Liberty to coordinate resistance. The pressure was so intense that Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. But they were UN backing down. They immediately passed the Declaratory Act, which stated that Britain had the right to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Essentially, they were saying, we'll let you off the hook this time, but don't forget who's in charge. Over the next few years, tensions just kept simmering. Britain tried again with the Townshend Acts, taxing things like glass, lead, paint, and tea. Again, the colonists resisted with boycotts. The situation grew more and more hostile, especially in Boston, a major hub of revolutionary sentiment. British troops were sent to keep order, but their presence only made things worse. This volatile mix exploded on March 5, 1770, in an event that would become known as the Boston Massacre. A confrontation between a mob of angry colonists and a squad of British soldiers ended with the soldiers firing into the crowd, killing 5 people. Patriots like Paul Revere and Samuel Adams used this event as powerful propaganda, painting the British as brutal tyrants. Things cooled down for a little while after that, but the fuse was lit. The final straw came in 1773 with the Tea Act. This act wasn't a new tax. It was designed to help the struggling British East India Company by allowing it to sell tea directly to the colonies, bypassing colonial merchants. Even though this made the tea cheaper, the colonists saw it as another trick to get them to accept Parliament's right to tax them. In December 1773, the Sons of Liberty in Boston decided to take direct action. Dressed as Native Americans, they boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. This act of defiance, the Boston Tea Party, was a point of no return. Britain's response was swift and severe. Parliament passed a series of laws known as the Coercive Acts, or the Intolerable Acts, as the colonists called them. They closed the port of Boston until the tea was paid for, restricted town meetings in Massachusetts, and gave more power to the royally appointed governor. This was meant to punish Massachusetts and isolate it, but it had the opposite effect. The other colonies saw it as an attack on all of them. If Britain could do this to Massachusetts, they could do it to anyone. In response to the Intolerable Acts, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, all except Georgia, convened in Philadelphia in 1774 for the First Continental Congress. They weren't calling for independence just yet. Their goal was to find a solution, to lay out their grievances, and ask the king to restore their rights. They organized a widespread boycott of British goods and agreed to meet again if their demands were unmet. But King George III and Parliament were in no mood to compromise. They saw the colonies as being in a state of open rebellion. The stage was set for war. The first shots were fired on April 19, 1775. British troops marched from Boston to the nearby towns of Lexington and Concord to seize a stockpile of colonial weapons. Paul Revere and other riders galloped through the night to warn the local militia, known as the Minutemen. At Lexington Green, a small group of Minutemen confronted the much larger British force. A shot rang out, no, one knows for sure who fired it, and the American Revolutionary War began. The British easily dispersed the militia at Lexington, but faced fierce resistance in Concord and were harassed by colonial fighters all the way back to Boston. The shot heard round the world had been fired. Following these battles, the Second Continental Congress convened. They established the Continental Army and, in a crucial decision, appointed George Washington of Virginia as its commander-in-chief. Washington wasn't the most brilliant military tactician, but he was a man of incredible character, determination, and leadership. He was the glue that would hold the army together through the darkest of times. Even with the war underway, many colonists still hoped for reconciliation, but those hopes faded with the publication of a pamphlet in early 1776 called Common Sense. Written by Thomas Paine, it was a blistering, plain-spoken argument for independence. Paine argued that it was absurd for a tiny island to rule a vast continent, and that America had a moral obligation to break free and create a new kind of government based on liberty. Common Sense was a runaway bestseller and swayed public opinion decisively toward independence. Inspired by this shift, the Continental Congress took the final, momentous step. They appointed a committee, which included Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, to draft a formal declaration. Jefferson was the primary author, and his words would echo through history. On July 4, 1776, the Congress officially adopted the Declaration of Independence. It declared that the 13 colonies were now free and independent states, and it laid out a revolutionary philosophy that all men are created equal, with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But declaring independence was one thing. Winning it was another. The early years of the war were incredibly difficult for the Continental Army. They were poorly trained, poorly equipped, and constantly short on supplies. They faced the most powerful military in the world. Washington's army suffered a series of defeats around New York and was forced into a desperate retreat across New Jersey. The cause of independence seemed on the brink of collapse. But then came a turning point. On a freezing Christmas night in 1776, Washington led his troops on a daring crossing of the icy Delaware River. They surprised and defeated a force of Hessian mercenaries at the Battle of Trenton. This small victory had a huge impact on morale, inspiring many soldiers to re-enlist and renewing faith in the Revolution. The next major turning point came in 1777 at the Battle of Saratoga in upstate New York. American forces, led by General Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold, surrounded and forced the surrender of an entire British army under General John Burgoyne. This victory was monumental because it convinced France that the Americans actually had a chance to win. Seeing an opportunity to weaken their old rival, Britain, the French officially entered the war on the American side in 1778. This was a game. France provided money, weapons, and, most importantly, a powerful navy that could challenge Britain's control of the seas. Spain and the Netherlands later joined the fight against Britain as well, turning the American Revolution into a global conflict. Even with French help, the war was far from over. The winter of 1777 to 78 at Valley Forge was a time of unimaginable hardship for Washington's army, with thousands dying from disease and starvation. But those who survived emerged as a more disciplined and professional fighting force, thanks in part to the training of the Prussian officer Baron von Steuben. The focus of the war then shifted to the southern colonies. The British captured major cities like Savannah and Charleston and hoped to rally the support of loyalist colonists who remained loyal to the crown. The fighting in the South was particularly brutal, often pitting neighbor against neighbor in a vicious civil war. But American generals like Nathanael Greene waged a brilliant campaign of attrition, wearing down the British forces under General Cornwallis. Finally, in 1781, Cornwallis moved his army to Yorktown, Virginia, a peninsula on the Chesapeake Bay, hoping to be resupplied by the British Navy. This was the moment Washington had been waiting for. In a perfectly executed plan, he coordinated with French ground troops and, crucially, the French Navy. The French fleet blocked the entrance to the Chesapeake, cutting off Cornwallis from any escape or reinforcement by sea. Meanwhile, the combined American and French armies surrounded him on land. Trapped and outnumbered, Cornwallis had no choice but to surrender his entire army on October 19, 1781. The Battle of Yorktown was the last major battle of the war. The defeat convinced the British government that the war was unwinnable. Peace negotiations began in Paris, and in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States of America. The American Revolution was more than just a war for independence. It was a revolution in ideas, challenging the old order of monarchy and aristocracy and championing the principles of liberty, equality, and self-government. It was a messy, complicated, and often brutal struggle, but it resulted in the birth of a new nation, founded on a promise of freedom that continues to inspire people around the world to this day. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next historical deep dive. We'll see you in the next one.